Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now let's dive into the stories. Mark had always dreamed of owning his own home. After years of renting and moving from one apartment to another, he finally found a place that felt right. It was an old house on the outskirts of town, a bit run down but full of potential. The real estate agent had warned him that it needed some work, but Mark didn't mind. He liked the idea of making a house his own. The price was too good to pass up, and the location was perfect, quiet, secluded, with a big yard and plenty of space. The first few days in the new house were exciting. Mark spent hours cleaning, painting, and unpacking his things. He enjoyed the solitude, the sense of peace that came with the property. At night, he'd sit in the living room, staring out the windows at the surrounding woods, feeling a sense of accomplishment. It felt like a fresh start, a new chapter in his life. But as the days passed, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific, just an unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach. The house creaked at night, the floorboards groaning underfoot as if it were settling. He brushed it off, telling himself that it was just the house being old. But as the weeks went on, the feeling grew stronger. One night, Mark woke up to the sound of something scraping against the wall. At first he thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal outside. But the sound continued, persistent, like nails dragging along the surface. He got out of bed and checked every room, convinced it was just his imagination. But everything was normal, too normal. Nothing was out of place. The next night it happened again. This time the sound seemed closer, like it was coming from the hallway. Mark's heart raced as he crept out of bed, flashlight in hand. He checked the front door and windows, making sure they were locked. Everything was secure, but the feeling of being watched lingered. He couldn't shake it. That's when he noticed something strange. The back door, the one that led to the yard, was slightly ajar. Mark was sure he had locked it before going to bed. He quickly closed it, locking it again, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave him. Over the next few days, strange things kept happening. Items would be moved, small things at first, a cup in the kitchen, a book on the shelf. Nothing significant, but enough to make Mark question his own sanity. He tried to reassure himself that he was just stressed from the move, but deep down he knew something wasn't right. Then one evening he heard a noise outside, a soft rustling near the back of the house. He cautiously approached the window, peering through the blinds. He saw a figure standing near the trees just out of sight. It was a man, tall and thin, with dark clothes. Mark's pulse quickened. He watched as the figure disappeared into the shadows of the woods. The next morning, Mark decided to call the police. He explained the strange occurrences and the man he had seen the night before. The officer on the phone was sympathetic, but after a brief investigation, they told Mark there was little they could do without more evidence. He felt frustrated, powerless, but they assured him they would keep an eye on the area. Still, the fear lingered. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind made his heart race. He started sleeping with a baseball bat next to his bed just in case. Then one evening Mark returned home after a long day of work. He was exhausted, his mind still preoccupied with the strange happenings at the house. As he stepped inside, he immediately noticed something different. The house felt colder, darker. He turned on the lights, but they flickered briefly before staying on. As he moved further into the house, he saw that the front door was slightly open. A chill ran down his spine. Mark knew he had locked it before leaving. But now it was ajar. His heart pounded as he slowly moved through the house, checking each room. Everything seemed undisturbed except for one thing. The basement door was wide open. Tension filled the air as he descended the stairs, the darkness swallowing him up. The air in the basement was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else. Something metallic. He scanned the room with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows. And then he saw it, a trail of muddy footprints leading toward the corner. The footsteps were fresh. Before he could react, he heard a noise behind him. A floorboard creaked and a cold breath grazed his neck. Mark spun around, but there was nothing there. The basement door slammed shut, trapping him inside. Something was in the house. He wasn't alone anymore. Mark's heart raced as he stood frozen in the basement, his flashlight flickering weakly. He tried to steady his breathing, but the darkness felt suffocating. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing the rooms. It was as if the house itself was alive, waiting. He grabbed the baseball bat beside him, his hands trembling as he gripped it tightly. With one last glance at the dark corner where the muddy footprints had led, Mark rushed toward the basement stairs. He needed to get out, but when he reached the door he found it locked. The knob wouldn't turn. Panic surged through him. His mind raced. Had someone locked him in from the outside? He tried again, shaking the door, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps upstairs grew louder, closer. They weren't coming from the rooms, they were moving toward the stairs. In a desperate attempt, Mark turned and looked for any way out of the basement. There was a small window at the top of one of the walls, too small for him to climb through, but big enough to see through. He moved toward it, feeling his way along the damp stone walls. Suddenly, a sound from behind him made him freeze, a low groan, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. Someone was in the basement with him. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. For a split second, he thought he saw a figure at the far end of the room, standing just out of the light's reach. His breath caught in his throat. It was the same man he'd seen outside, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes. His face was obscured by the shadows, but Mark could feel his eyes on him. Without thinking, Mark lunged for the stairs again, desperate to escape. But as he reached for the door handle, something cold gripped his ankle. He looked down, his breath coming in sharp gasps. A hand, pale and bony, was clutching his leg. With every ounce of strength, Mark kicked free, stumbling backward onto the basement floor. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled toward the window. He reached out, but just as his fingers touched the frame, a loud thud echoed through the basement. The door to the basement was open. The man was standing in the doorway. "Don't run," he said, his voice low and cold. "You won't get far." Mark's pulse raced. He had no choice but to make a run for it. He bolted toward the open door, pushing past the man, but as he reached the stairs, something grabbed his wrist. "You'll regret this," the man hissed. Mark's body went into full survival mode. He twisted his arm out of the man's grip and raced up the stairs, the sound of pursuit right behind him. He burst into the hallway, his eyes darting for an escape route. He didn't care where he went, just as long as he got away. He reached the front door, yanking it open, but before he could step outside he froze. The man was standing in the doorway, blocking his exit. "You can't leave," he said with a twisted grin. "Not yet." Mark didn't hesitate. With a surge of adrenaline, he lunged toward the kitchen, his thoughts scattered, focusing only on getting out. But as he turned the corner, he ran straight into something or someone. A figure stepped out from the shadows, tall, silent, and eerily still. The second man. Mark was trapped. The two figures closed in on him, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. His pulse thundered in his ears as he realized he had no way out. The house, once his sanctuary, had become his prison. He felt the walls closing in, the darkness growing thicker, suffocating him. "Why are you doing this?" Mark managed to ask, his voice trembling. The man who had been following him smiled darkly, stepping closer. "You shouldn't have come here." Suddenly the lights flickered once more, plunging the house into pitch blackness. Mark could hear the sounds of the men shifting in the dark, but he couldn't see them. His fear turned into something primal, fight or flight. He turned and bolted toward the back door, shoving past the second man. The door slammed open and he was outside, gasping for breath as he raced toward the woods. His mind screamed for him to run, to get as far from the house as possible, but his legs felt heavy, as though the ground was pulling him back. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Someone was chasing him. Mark's thoughts blurred as he stumbled through the trees, branches slashing at his face, the dark night surrounding him. But then, through the thick forest, he saw something, the faint glow of lights. A house. He wasn't alone. Or so he thought. As Mark reached the house, he looked back, expecting to see the two men following him. But they were gone. In their place was an empty path leading into the woods, the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. It was eerily quiet. He didn't hesitate. Mark knocked on the door, urgently, his mind racing. Whoever lived here had to help him. But when the door opened, it wasn't a neighbor standing there. It was the same man. The one who had been in the house. The one who had been chasing him. "Welcome to your new home," he whispered before the door slammed shut behind him. Mark's heart stopped. He couldn't move, couldn't think as the door slammed in his face. Panic surged through him and he instinctively tried to open the door, but it was locked from the inside. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away, his mind racing, struggling to understand what was happening. He turned to run, but before he could take a step, the man appeared again, stepping out of the shadows. His cold, empty eyes seemed to pierce right through Mark. The man didn't speak this time. He just watched, his presence unnerving and overpowering. Mark stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him. He had no strength left, no plan, nothing but the overwhelming fear coursing through his veins. His mind screamed at him to wake up, to snap out of this nightmare, but nothing made sense anymore. The man knelt down in front of him, his cold fingers grazing Mark's cheek. "You've always been so eager to escape," he murmured. "But you're just like the others." Mark's mind was spinning. What? What do you want from me?" The man tilted his head as though considering the question. "I want you to understand. You're here now. This house has claimed you. There's no leaving it once you've stepped inside." Mark's pulse pounded in his ears, his thoughts racing. This couldn't be real. There had to be a way out. He couldn't stay here in this suffocating house with these men, these monsters. He had to find a way to escape. Suddenly the man stood up, taking a step back. Mark's breath caught. He couldn't believe it, but the man was smiling. A smile so twisted and sinister it made Mark's skin crawl. "You'll be part of the house soon enough," the man said, his voice low and dark. "Just like the others before you." Mark's thoughts flickered back to the house. The strange noises. The unsettling feeling that had never quite left him. Was it possible? Could this house really have a hold over people? Was it more than just bricks and wood? Before he could gather his thoughts, the man stepped back into the darkness, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. Mark was left standing there, trembling, his mind too shocked to comprehend what had just happened. But something was different now. The air around him was thicker, colder. The trees seemed to lean closer and the house behind him. It looked different now, as though it were watching him, waiting for him to make a move. As Mark turned to run, his feet felt heavy as though the ground beneath him had changed. Every step felt slower, more labored. He looked over his shoulder, but there was nothing there, no one following him. Just the empty woods, the same as before. But then in the distance he saw something, a shadow moving, slipping between the trees. It was too fast to be human, too fluid, like a figure that didn't belong. Mark froze. He realized then, in a horrible flash of clarity, that he wasn't alone in the woods. The house wasn't just a building, it was something else, something alive. And once it took hold of you, it didn't let go. It couldn't. In that moment, Mark understood the true terror of his situation. The house wasn't just a place. It was a trap, and he was already caught. He had stepped into something that was always waiting for him. And as he turned to face the house again, he knew it was already too late. The door was opening not from the inside but from the very walls. Slowly, inexorably, the house was pulling him back in. Mark could hear the whispers in the wind now, the voices of those who had come before him, trapped in the house for eternity, never to escape. There was no way out. And Mark knew with absolute certainty that there never had been. Anna and Ben had been searching for the perfect house for months. After years of apartment living, they were finally ready for a change, something that would give them space to grow and settle into a life they had always dreamed of. When they stumbled upon the house, it felt like fate. A charming two-story home in a quiet neighborhood, with a garden out back and a white picket fence. It was everything they'd ever wanted. The price was right, and the real estate agent assured them it was in good condition. The first few days were bliss. They spent time unpacking, setting up their furniture, and painting the walls in soft, welcoming colors. The rooms were bright and airy, and the large windows let in plenty of sunlight. The neighborhood was peaceful, and they quickly fell into a routine, enjoying their new life. But as they settled in, strange things began to happen. At first, it was small things, a light left on that they were sure they had turned off, the faint sound of footsteps at night when they were both fast asleep. Anna chalked it up to nerves. After all, moving to a new house was always a bit unsettling. Ben, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as nothing more than their imagination playing tricks. But the odd occurrences continued. One evening, as they sat in the living room watching TV, Anna noticed something peculiar out of the corner of her eye. A figure, dark and shadowy, seemed to flicker just beyond the window. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, but as she turned to Ben to mention it, she saw the same thing, the figure standing just outside watching them. Ben laughed, brushing it off as someone walking by, but Anna couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The next night things escalated. Anna was the first to hear it, a soft knocking coming from somewhere deep in the house. At first she thought it was the pipes or the wind, but then it happened again. 3 distinct knocks, one after the other. She tried to ignore it, but her heart was pounding. She got up to check, walking through the dark hallways with a growing sense of dread. When she reached the basement door, she stopped. The door, which had been closed since they moved in, was now slightly ajar. It had never opened on its own before. Her mind raced as she stepped closer, the silence in the house growing thick with tension. She could feel something was wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint it. Slowly she reached for the door, pushing it open. The basement was empty, but the air inside was cold, unnaturally so. It smelled musty, like something old and forgotten. Anna didn't go down, but she stood in the doorway for a long moment, trying to shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. That night Anna couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the house. The sound of footsteps echoed through the halls again, though Ben was fast asleep beside her, oblivious to the growing sense of unease. She pulled the covers up around her, trying to ignore the whispers that seemed to grow louder, the feeling that the house was alive, watching her every move. The next morning Ben was the one who noticed it. As they sat down for breakfast, he looked over at Anna, his face pale. "Did you see it?" he asked, his voice shaky. "What?" Anna asked, her stomach sinking. "The reflection," Ben said, looking out the window. "In the glass. I saw someone standing there behind us." Anna's heart skipped a beat. She turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the empty yard outside. She felt a shiver run down her spine. That was when they both began to realize that something was terribly wrong. The house wasn't just old, it felt wrong, like something was buried beneath its floors, hidden in its walls. At night, the shadows moved on their own, and the temperature would drop unexpectedly. Sometimes when they walked through the halls, they would both hear a voice, soft and distant, whispering their names. They reached out to the neighbors, hoping to find some answers. An elderly woman who lived next door, Mrs. Carter, was the first to offer them a bit of information. "The house has a history," she said, lowering her voice as if afraid someone might hear. "The previous owners. They weren't the first ones to live there. That house has changed hands many times over the years. People come and go, but they never stay long. There's something about it. I've heard strange noises too." Her words left them shaken. "What kind of strange noises?" Anna asked. Mrs. Carter looked around nervously before speaking in a whisper. "The sound of children laughing, crying, playing. But there are no children around here." The next few days were a blur of unease. The noises became louder, more frequent, as though they were being followed by invisible footsteps, whispers echoing in their ears. They would hear someone breathing or the soft rustle of clothing, but no one was there. Then one evening it all came to a head. Ben was downstairs in the living room when he heard a noise coming from above. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. He rushed upstairs, his heart pounding. The hallway was empty, but as he walked past the guest bedroom, he saw the door open slightly, just a crack, but enough to make him stop. He approached the door, feeling an overwhelming urge to open it. When he did, his breath caught in his throat. The room was covered in dust, the furniture untouched. But there, in the center of the floor, was a single doll. Its eyes were wide open, its mouth frozen in a permanent smile. Ben reached down to pick it up, but before he could touch it, the door slammed shut behind him. Panicked, Ben tried to open the door, but it was stuck. The room began to grow darker, the air thick and oppressive. He could hear the sound of children's laughter, high-pitched and eerie, echoing through the room. Finally the door gave way and Ben rushed out, his heart racing. He found Anna downstairs, her face pale and drawn. "I heard it too," she whispered. "The voices? They're in the walls." That night they left. They packed up their things and drove away, not knowing where they were going, only that they couldn't stay in that house any longer. The house that had promised them a fresh start, only to reveal a darkness they couldn't escape. Years later they heard that the house was sold again, But this time no one stayed for long. The new owners left after just a few weeks, saying it was too unsettling, too strange. And the house, as it always had, waited for the next family to come. Months passed, and the memory of the house haunted Anna and Ben in ways they hadn't expected. The terror of those final days lingered in their minds, creeping into their thoughts during quiet moments. Despite their attempts to move on, the unsettling feeling never truly left them. They had relocated, of course, found a new place, but the house stayed with them, like a shadow they couldn't outrun. One rainy afternoon, as they were cleaning out some old boxes, Anna came across something, a small, dusty envelope with their names on it. She didn't recognize the handwriting, and when she opened it, she found nothing but a single, neatly folded note inside. Her hand trembled as she read the words written in ink, chilling in their simplicity. "You were never meant to leave." Her stomach twisted, the words too familiar, too eerie. She passed the note to Ben, who looked just as shaken. "We need to go back," Anna said softly, the decision forming in her mind before the words left her lips. Ben looked at her, disbelief in his eyes. "What? Are you crazy? After everything that happened?" But Anna was determined. There was something unfinished, some unanswered question gnawing at her. She needed to understand what the house wanted, what it was that had drawn them in and held them there in those dark days. The thought of returning was terrifying, but they both knew they could never truly leave the house behind unless they faced it one last time. The drive back to the old neighborhood was long and filled with tense silence. The sky was overcast, and the trees along the side of the road seemed to close in on them as they passed. As they neared the house, Anna felt her chest tighten. It stood there, dark and ominous, much the way they had left it, unchanged, waiting. They parked down the street, out of sight. Neither of them spoke as they got out of the car and walked toward the house. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the house was pulling them in, unwilling to let them go. As they approached the front door, the familiar creak of the wood under their feet sent a shiver through them. The house was silent, its windows dark and lifeless, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for them to enter. When Anna reached for the doorknob, it was cold to the touch, but it turned easily. The door opened with a faint groan and they stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, but there was something else, something heavier. A sense of oppression. The kind of feeling you get when you're being watched. They both felt it at once. "Let's just get this over with," Ben said, his voice tight with anxiety. They made their way through the house, every room feeling colder, darker. The hallways seemed endless, stretching farther than they remembered, and the silence was suffocating. As they reached the guest bedroom, they paused. Anna could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The door was ajar again, just like it had been that night they'd fled. The house seemed to be beckoning them, but something was different this time. The shadows seemed deeper, darker. "I don't think we should go in," Ben said, his voice shaky. "We don't know what's in there." But Anna stepped forward, her hand reaching for the door. She pushed it open slowly, cautiously. The room was unchanged. The furniture was still covered in dust, the air still thick with neglect. But then something caught her eye. On the floor, in the exact spot where they had seen the doll last time, there was something new, a small, carved wooden figure. Anna crouched down, her breath catching in her throat as she reached for it. It was intricate, a tiny figure of a child, with eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. The craftsmanship was delicate, almost too perfect. But it was wrong. So wrong. She picked it up, feeling a chill spread through her fingers. The moment her hand touched the figure, the temperature in the room dropped drastically. Her breath fogged in front of her, and she felt an overwhelming presence in the room, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. Then the whispers started. Low at first, like distant voices, but then clearer, louder, closer. Ben grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the figure. "We need to go. Now." But Anna couldn't move. She was frozen, her gaze locked on the figure. The whispers had turned into words, but they weren't coming from anywhere she could see. They were coming from inside her mind, a chorus of voices, whispering in unison. "You should have never come back." Before she could react, the room seemed to twist around her. The walls bulged inward, and the floor beneath her feet felt as though it was tilting. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Ben's grip tightened on her arm. "Anna, snap out of it." With great effort, Anna tore her gaze away from the figure, blinking rapidly as if waking from a trance. The room was still, no longer moving, but the air was thick with tension. The whispers faded, but the feeling of being watched, being trapped, remained. "We need to leave," Anna said, her voice barely a whisper. "Now." They rushed out of the room and down the stairs, but when they reached the front door it wouldn't open. Ben pulled at the handle, his panic rising, but the door was stuck as though something invisible was holding it shut. Suddenly the temperature dropped again, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the house, heavy, deliberate. Anna spun around, but there was no one there. Then they heard it. A voice. Deep, guttural, and unmistakably clear. "You're not leaving." The door flew open on its own, and the house seemed to exhale, releasing its grip on them. Without a second thought, they bolted out of the house and into the yard, not stopping until they reached the car. As they sped away, the house loomed behind them, dark and silent once again. Anna looked at Ben, her breath shaky. "What was that?" she whispered. Ben didn't answer. He couldn't. They never spoke about it again, but the memory of that house stayed with them forever. Every time they closed their eyes they could still hear the whispers. Still feel the presence that had followed them. The house, like the past, was never truly gone. And it was waiting for the next ones. Years went by, and Anna and Ben tried to rebuild their lives, far from the shadows of the house. They had moved to a new city, started fresh with new jobs, and built a new home, one that was peaceful and full of light. But the darkness from that old house never truly left them. It lingered in their dreams, in the quiet moments when the world seemed still, when their minds wandered back to that place. One evening Anna received a letter. It was unexpected, the envelope plain and without a return address. As soon as she opened it, a cold chill ran down her spine. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but there was no mistaking the words. "You should have never left." Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hands trembled as she held the note. The words were chilling in their simplicity, but it wasn't the message that unnerved her, it was the feeling she got, as though the house was reaching out to her again. She could almost feel it pulling her back. She showed the letter to Ben, his face paling as he read it. It was a reminder they hadn't wanted. A warning. "We have to go back," Anna said, her voice quieter than she expected. Ben stared at her, his expression conflicted. The fear in his eyes matched her own, but there was also an undeniable need to understand. To face it once and for all. They made the decision together, albeit with heavy hearts, and within hours they were on the road again, heading toward the house that had haunted them for so long. The familiar sense of dread returned as they neared the old neighborhood. The rain was pouring down, the sky dark and oppressive. When they reached the house, it stood there in its eerie silence as though it had been waiting. The front yard, overgrown and unkempt, looked as if time itself had stopped. No lights flickered, no sounds emanated from within. But Anna and Ben knew better. They knew the house wasn't empty. They parked and walked up the steps, feeling every inch of their past fears creeping up their spines. The door was still there, as if frozen in time, waiting to be opened again. And this time, it opened without hesitation, as though it had been expecting them. Inside, the house felt different. The oppressive air was heavier than before, and every floorboard groaned with age and wear. But there was an unsettling stillness, an absence of the voices, the whispers. It was almost as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for something. They moved through the rooms, more cautious than ever, until they reached the guest bedroom, the room that had once felt like the heart of the house's haunting presence. The door creaked open slowly, and there in the middle of the room was the same carved figure. This time it was bigger, more detailed. It wasn't just a child anymore, but a family with dark, hollow eyes and expressions of silent torment. Anna approached the figure, a sense of inevitability flooding her. Ben stood back, watching in silence as if he knew what was coming. Suddenly the house seemed to come alive. The air shifted, cold winds swept through the room, and the faint sound of whispers returned, growing louder, more urgent. The temperature plummeted. Then Anna heard it, a low, guttural voice from behind her, like a whisper from the walls themselves. "You are part of it now." Without warning, the door slammed shut behind them. The room seemed to close in on them, the walls groaning with the weight of something ancient and powerful. The whispers turned into harsh, unintelligible mutterings. And for the first time, Anna felt it, the weight of a presence that wasn't just the house. It was something older, something that had been waiting long before they ever set foot inside. She reached out for Ben, but when she turned to him, he was no longer the person she had known. His face had changed, twisted with a dark, unnatural expression. His eyes were hollow and a cruel smile played on his lips. "You never left," he whispered. Anna backed away, panic rising in her chest. "Ben? What?" But he stepped forward, his movement jerky, unnatural. He was no longer the man she loved. He was something else, something trapped in the house just like the others before them. The room darkened, the figure on the floor casting long, sinister shadows. Anna tried to run, but the walls seemed to close in on her, trapping her in the suffocating darkness. Then the voice echoed through her mind again, "You belong to us now." She collapsed to her knees, feeling herself pulled toward the figure. The whispers grew louder, deafening in their intensity. And as she reached out, she understood. The house had been feeding on them all along, and now they were part of it, part of the endless cycle of those who had come before. The last thing she saw was the figure, its hollow eyes staring at her with a final, chilling promise. They were never meant to leave.